I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Blair Rubel, and I work together with Allison Garland and Mijgan Masumi in running the Comparative Urban Studies program here at the Wilson Center. I think as many of you know, CUSP, as we call it, around the Wilson Center, was started by Joe Tolchin about a dozen years ago, my colleague who was running the Latin America program at the time. And Joe is now retired, but I nonetheless want to thank him in absentia because the whole program really evolved with his leadership and guidance. And I also want to thank Allison and Mijgan, who have done a wonderful job in pulling everything together for today's meeting. I have other people I want to thank as well, and I think that's as it should be, because an event that is as impressive as and exciting as this meeting really depends on the help of many, many people. So I'd like to thank Mike Keshishian, who has actually just returned, I guess, yesterday from India. So I think he's here in spirit as well as in body. And we'd like to thank him and his colleagues with the urban program teams of the Office of Poverty Reduction in the Bureau of Economic Growth, Agriculture, and Trade at USAID. I hope I got that right. This meeting is a series of seminars and meetings that we've been working on in cooperation with our colleagues at the urban team at AID, and it's really been wonderful working with them. We've worked with them for a couple of years now, and this is the second of what will be, we hope, 8 meetings over more or less the next year, focusing on urban issues, and we hope that these will be useful for everybody in the Washington community. I also want to thank Global Health, the Global Health Initiative, for their help in informing people about today's event. There are 2 other housekeeping announcements I need to make, which are some importance, and I'll repeat them at the end. But please be sure you signed in. There's a sign-up sheet, and that's important for us, both to have some sense of who is here today and also to keep you informed about our programming. And also, there is an evaluation form that's out there, and it's very important that we ask that you fill out the evaluation form and return it to us. The other announcement is that this seminar is being webcast and will be available for viewing in a couple of days on the Wilson Center Comparative Urban Studies Project website. So if you know people who can't be here who might be interested in it, probably by next week it'll be up there, and you can go to www.wilsoncenter.org and find Comparative Urban Studies, and they can watch it. And they might want to do that because it really is a delight to be able to sit up here and introduce this particular panel of sage and wise folk. I'm going to dispense with long introductions, but I have to say something about each of the speakers, but I want to do it all together so I won't be interrupting the flow of the conversation once it begins. We're going to hear first from Akin Mabogunje, who is chairman of the Presidential Technical Board of the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria. But of course, he's much more than that. He's had an academic career of great distinction. He received his university education at University College Ibadan and at University College London. He then taught for a number of years before, quote-unquote, retiring in 1981. He taught at several prestigious universities around the world, and he's the author of far too many books to mention because the list is much too long, but one that appeared not too long ago is entitled State of the Earth, Contemporary Geographic Perspectives. That would, you would think, be enough of a career for one person, but he also has an even more distinguished career, or equally distinguished career, in public service. He's been involved in so many presidential commissions in Nigeria that I can't even begin to list them, and he's been involved in a number of international boards and projects. His recent work with the Federal Mortgage Bank of Nigeria has engaged him in developing housing delivery systems for the Nigerian public that can become long-term sustainable and affordable through the development of a robust system of mortgage finance and private sector-led estate development. His considerable accomplishments include a number of honorary doctoral degrees from Michigan State University, the Stockholm School of Economics, on and on and on, and as no surprise listening to all of this, he is a recipient of the Nigerian Order of Merit, his nation's highest award for distinguished contributions to academic and international life. He will be followed by Billy Cobbett, who is Senior Urban Upgrading Advisor for Cities Alliance, a global partnership based at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. He's a senior manager in UN Habitat in Nairobi, where he's been involved in designing and launching the global campaign for secure tenure. And he previously was, among many other things, assignments and positions, Director General for Housing in South Africa, and after the '94 elections, Director of Housing in Cape Town, before joining the United Nations. Our third equally distinguished speaker, Jane Geyer, is Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. Again, I can't possibly do justice to her biography. She was trained at London School of Economics and the University of Rochester, which is an important element of her intellectual biography because it shows that she's rooted in British approaches to anthropology, which is important. She also studied in Nigeria and wrote her dissertation on organizational planning of traditional farming in Western Nigeria. She's taught at a number of institutions, the University of North Carolina, Peabody College, the National School of Nursing and Midwifery in Cameroon, Boston University, Harvard, Northwestern, and now Johns Hopkins. She's one of the most striking aspects of her biography for someone like myself who values field research. She spent an extensive amount of time in her field research and is a prominent figure in the African studies community. She too has written far too many books, but I want to mention one, obscure part of my background. I once wrote a book called Money Sings. So she wrote a book called Money, Struggles, and City Life. So I had to pull that one out in particular. And I think at that I'm going to stop and step back and let this wonderful panel have the floor. I hope I haven't done injustice to anyone, but I think once you hear everybody speak, you'll realize how lucky we are. So with that, Professor Mabogunje, please get us started.
Thank you very much, Blair. I'd like to start by thanking the panel on Comparative Urban Studies project of Woodrow Wilson Center, not only for inviting me, but for bearing with me for not being able to be here last December. As I explained, other engagement in Nigeria made it impossible for me to be here on that occasion. But my heart was here because the topic we're discussing is so central to many issues that half the time we don't see the connection. And the problem is that people do say that the problem of poverty in the 21st century is almost an affront on human capabilities and ingenuity, that really it should be possible to resolve the problem of poverty. And when you now move it from the rural hinterland, as it were, and you put it right in our face in urban centers, then of course, I mean, the problem becomes even more confounding. In the Africa case, what we're now confronted with is not only that the poverty moved to the city, but it's getting worse by the day. And so when I got the letter saying we must try and see whether we can articulate a research agenda for the urban poverty situation in Africa, what I tried to do in the paper which I sent to the center is to raise a number of issues which I would be presenting very soon. I'm of course not very sure whether my articulation of the issues are clear enough, but I hope with the benefit of the discussants and the contributors to that paper, we might be able to start to get a better focus on why poverty, urban poverty in Africa is moving against the trend in other developing regions of the world. Instead of being reduced, it is deepening. I raised 4 issues in the paper. The first is, what is particularly urban about poverty? What makes it different, as it were, from rural poverty? The second is, why is the urban poverty situation in Africa so peculiar? And I want to raise some issues about the Africa situation in regard to poverty. The third, of course, in trying to position this within a conceptual framework, is to see whether one can attempt an explanation of that peculiarity of the African situation. And the third is, against the background of that peculiarity, to see what the people, the societies themselves have been trying to do to cope with poverty. Because it's not true that the poor are just waiting for us to come and save them. They're designing all sorts of mechanisms and institutions to see whether they can get out of that. And it is against the background of those 4 issues that I then tried to see how can we, what sort of research agenda can we articulate from those issues. So let me start by looking at what is urban about poverty. I believe, in spite of the use of the income measure, the famous $1 per day, that people who live below that critical poverty line are poor, that it's now generally agreed that poverty is multifaceted, and various people, including the United Nations, have tried to indicate the broad areas you should take into account when you're looking at poverty: access to water, child mortality, education, and so on. But Satterthwaite attempted, in his own paper, and I thought he did a good job, to identify 8 aspects of what he regards tend to separate urban poverty from the rural. And I wanted to call attention to those 8. That he points out that urban poverty, the most obvious thing is, of course, inadequate income. But with that also often goes tendency to indebtedness. The second element is the inadequate and unstable asset base of the poor. The third, of course, is their inadequate shelter, which tends to be more slum and shanty town. The fourth is their inadequate access to public infrastructure. The sixth, their inadequate access to basic services in education, health, and so on. I think that was the fifth. The sixth is the limited or the absence of safety net in the urban situation. The seventh would be the poor protection of their human rights, particularly within both the distributive justice and the justice system in the city. And of course, the eighth and the final one which he identified is their general voicelessness and powerlessness. Now, he argues that you tend to find these coming together and identifying urban as distinct from rural. But he also noticed that the dynamics of this means that in the bigger cities, I mean, it's not the same thing in the smaller as well as in the bigger cities. So you have to take the factor of size into account when you're looking at urban poverty. But also that the other dynamic situation has to do with policies. And particularly in the case of Africa, the 80s, when many of the countries had to accept the structural adjustment program and had to cut down on many social services and retrenchment and so on, we created a new category of poor people, but who are really either borderline poor or new poor, or if you like, transitory poor. And they needed to be distinguished from the chronic poor, whom most of the discussion really is about. So we need to bear in mind then that urban poverty has these various characteristics, and that it varies both in terms of the size of cities and the circumstances of the society at a particular time. But the more important thing is then to ask, what is peculiar about urban poverty in the Africa context, which make me title this paper, The Africa Case. And that peculiarity is also meant to establish why it has been worsening the poverty in the cities. On this score, I raised about 4 issues. The first, of course, is the fact that urbanization in Africa generally is a phenomenon of very recent vintage. For most countries, it came with the colonial administration, although there were parts of Africa where we had pre-industrial and pre-colonial cities. But generally, it is recent, 19th century. Generally also, therefore, it was a colonial establishment in many places, and the Africans were really not encouraged to be part of the city, although they could have township outside of the city, or encouraged to continue to live wherever. When we now suddenly find ourselves with many cities, some of them millionaire cities, some already mega cities, there are issues which we then have to look at in respect of those urbanizations, because in the literature we tend to expect cities to grow because there are employment opportunities in the cities. Because a lot of people are moving from rural areas into the cities. Now, this is not always very correct in the case of Africa. People are moving to the cities, but the cities also is providing, through natural increase, a sizable proportion of inhabitants for the cities because of the concentration of health facilities, educational facilities, much better living condition in the basic, in the core area of the city. And therefore, when you take advantage of those, you tend to have relatively lower infant mortality, and therefore a lot of children in the cities, which then means that the dependency ratio, what you have to do for cities in those contexts, is not simply a city of young, a lot of young, economically active people, but cities which also tend to have this huge size of dependent resident. Now, in recent times, of course, this whole issue had been compounded by the HIV/AIDS and the advantage which cities tended to have had in the 80s and so on is not being sustained because the level of prevalence of AIDS in the city is tended to be much higher relatively than they are in the rural area. So the high dependency ratio in urban area is a factor of African urbanization. The inadequacy of industrial growth has also been a factor, which means that most of the cities, therefore, the economy cannot be expected to grow in the way we expect economies of cities to grow. In fact, it's claimed for many West African cities, for instance, that 70% of the population depend on the informal sector. And the informal sector is not a very active growth-inducing sector of the economy. And so we find a situation in which people coming into the city are coming because of deteriorating situation in the rural area. But they're moving into urban areas which are undercapitalized and where situations themselves, for the poor in particular, are not, what all you can say about it is that they're deplorable. But they look a lot better than the situation in the rural area, or at least when they think of coming, they believe it is a lot better. Now, some of these urban problems, of course, have arisen post-colonial, when in fact the restraint on migration, which was there in the colonial period, had to be removed because we now had independent African countries, or independent government. But these were governments that came to power through the over-centralization of power. And one of the things one has to bear in mind is whether you were looking at a one-party state or a military state, the temptation has always been to centralize power. Now, what that does when you're thinking of cities, or let me move one step back. When you centralize power, you then assume that government can provide most of what are needed, and that's what they did. They established so many parastatals to provide water, to provide even to remove refuse, to provide education. These were all parastatals of the central government, and if you were in a federal country like mine, both the federal and the state government all concentrate power to themselves. And because of that concentration, of course, it was easy to become corrupt and to promote a lot of malfeasance. And it's only in the late 80s that the talk about decentralization and democratization started to be heard. And even at that point, the whole concept was not to devolve power to the local government, which is better able to handle issues of poverty, but rather to deconcentrate political power. In other words, For many countries, what was being decentralized were just offices of central administration, not power and resources to the local level. So we have a situation in many African countries today that the local government remains relatively weak, not really empowered to do what it is best able to do. And therefore, when we're talking about urban poverty, we should also be talking about the poverty of urban centers, of municipal authorities. So you have poor people coming into cities which themselves are poorly managed and poorly empowered. I then attempted to provide a conceptual framework for looking at this general problem of development in Africa, and suggested that we need to move back a bit from that general picture and look at where Africa is coming from and what is the implication of this, not just for urban poverty, but for the fact that it has not been easy to reduce it the way we would have loved to. I think it's important for my conceptual frame to argue that you have to look at the fact that the particular form of pre-capitalist formation from which Africa is coming needs to be understood. Because what the colonial governments were trying to do in many African countries was to integrate their economy into the global capitalist economy. But they were doing that in the context of a pre-capitalist economy that was not feudal, that was not even mercantilist, but really was peasant. And I believe Goran Haydn was the first person who kept calling our attention to the fact that in Africa, the peasants remain a very important factor for development, precisely because they own their means of production. And that Africa is unique in that context, that unlike elsewhere in the world where other social classes have captured the peasant and captured their right to the basic means of production, which is land, that in Africa, land still remains what every peasant family, lineage, individual can own. What does this mean? It also means, to a large extent, the basic organizing principle for the economy is kinship-based. And kinship decides whether you own land, where you own it. Kinship decides where you live. Kinship even decides how you handle capital, all the factors of production. It even decides what type of skills you can acquire within the pre-capitalist social formation. And so when the colonial governments came, their job was to see what to do with this, because they're coming with a capitalist orientation, which requires that all these factors of production need to be commoditized so that you can take them to a market, that they can be subjected to the laws of supply and demand, and that they have a price tag, and they have a market for land, market for labor, market for capital, market for... Now, it is interesting reading our history, what they had to do to commoditize labor, to make us become wage earners as distinct from peasant, free peasant owners of our own production, using our family labor largely, and of course, other ways of handling this. When it came to land, and that's the issue that I want to underscore, the colonial government all over Africa bulged. We still have a situation in most African countries today where, although we know people have rights of usage to land, they do not have right of exchange. In other words, their land has not become an economic asset. It's a used asset which they can farm on, but which they cannot exchange. So if I decide to leave my farm in the rural area, there is no market where I can say, this land which I'm no longer used, can I sell it and then have some money to come to the city? I can only leave it and hope that some other family member may want to use it. That's all the right I have. And in the paper, I try to explain why this is so. Now, the critical point about that is, of course, that because I couldn't have that if I migrate to the city, then I'm coming almost without anything. And so many migrants in Africa, when they move to the cities, I indicate here, they're confronted by 5 disjunctures, things that are so different from the background they're coming from to what they're coming to. The most obvious I have explained, that they come without any economic asset. And that asset remains uneconomic, and its problem has to do with what you then do in a context where most of the institutions in the cities are already part of the capitalist system. The only way you can have access to credit, for instance, in the city would be if you had a collateral, which you can't have because your land is still enmeshed in that kinship structure. So you come and you can't do anything on the economic front. You're then confronted with a special disjuncture too, because suddenly you realize that a city has this compact organization of houses in which you have to move by transport, and there's competition if you move to the center. If you stay at the periphery, you have certain advantages, but the jobs all tend to be closer to the center. And if you have to start moving by transport, then the transport cost becomes a daily element in your budget. In the rural area, you don't have to worry about that. Then you meet the social disjuncture. There is no social network, no solidarity group, no safety net, basically. I'm saying you meet this disjuncture, and I'll be talking later on about what the Africans were doing to deal with all of these problems. Then at the family level, you then have to deal with the loss of the collective responsibility for looking after the young, for being part of a lineage or a kin group, and so on. And the family support you used to depend on is no longer there. And of course, on the political side, you meet a disjuncture in which, in fact, again, within the pre-capitalist system, there are various issues like age grades, association, occupational guilds, and so on, which no longer effectively operate in a city that is guided by a capitalist configuration of factors. It's important to put this on, what I've just been saying, to see how the Africans themselves, faced with this problem, knowing they come in almost, what did they do? And the issue of poverty is not just now, it was always there, only it's become deeper. And what they've had to do is always been to go back to this kinship basis, this community solidarity basis, to cope with the problem of the city. And I give a few examples. One of the major things they always do is to start finding out who and who came from an area, what they call the hometown association, or in the French-speaking area, they call it Association d'Originaire, where we originated from. And we try to form association to do two things. One, to make it possible to settle into the city, maybe to find a job, maybe to deal with the police if they start arresting you for vagrancy, maybe to do various things, but also to see whether we can improve the situation back home, especially in terms of education. Maybe we collect money to start building schools back in the hometown. We collect money to start doing maybe even water in our hometown, to do a number of things to see if we could reduce your exposure to the poverty scourge that you might meet when you come to the city. We also put emphasis on things like the rotating credit group. Since we know we can't get into the banks, we then sit together to see how we can put our money together to do things. And in the papers, I gave the example of a group in the Cameroon. Okay, their name escaped me just now. Who did that so well that, in fact, they were able to say, we will start, if you like, a bank, a community-type bank. And they did, except that the government then kept saying, we would give you the managing director. And they know that's the way not to go, because the managing director is likely to blow their money. So they disbanded themselves and went back to the informal way they were doing it before. The same thing when you come into the city, there's this, within the area you live in, those who've been there before or who managed to get some access to owning land and having a house, you establish some clientele relationship with them, and they become like your big uncle in the city. And one can go on. The point I want to make about these various institutions is that the local, the migrants, the poor people, trust them. They contrast sharply with the government or the state-sponsored institution, like even the local government. And a colleague of mine writing on this issue as between the state-sponsored institutions and this, if you like, primordial institution that we're trying to put together to survive in the city, that one is amoral, and therefore it tends to allow you to do all sorts of, you'll say, rascality, corruption. The other is very moral, the one tied to hometown association, rotating credit, that he says for many Africans, we then tend to relate to these two public in different ways that you would find. I'll use the Nigerian example. If I were the treasurer of the hometown association from which I come, I will dare not steal a kobo of their money. If, however, I became the chairman of the local council for the same community, I don't feel the same constraint about dealing with the money of the local community, because I know it's coming from the state, and although it's meant for us to improve ourselves, even if I don't do it, some people will be telling me, are you stupid? Your colleagues are all doing it, so why are you paying attention to that type of morality? Now, that's still a problem, and I could say that once when I was involved with a project to deal with a city consultation for poverty reduction, I was surprised the market women were asking, how can we merge these two type of governance so that the hassle and malfeasance of the young men running the city council can be merged with the, morality of those who are in the traditional. I'll try and run quickly through what I then try to do, because I see I'm running out of time. What I'm trying to say, therefore, is that when we're looking at the problem of poverty reduction, we have all these institutions. We need to find out what the people are doing for themselves, as against what we conventionally accept government should be doing for them. Because government at that level tends to be very weak. So I then said, if we therefore are going to try and articulate a research agenda, I suggest we look at 4 or 5 areas of what could be done. Appreciating the complexity of the situation. The first, of course, is that we really have to establish the magnitude of who are the urban poor. The $1 a day criteria, I'm not sure gives us the best picture sometimes, because we conflate the people in the informal sector with the urban poor, and they're not necessarily the same thing. And the problem we had, I was calling attention to when we call it this global satellite, the GSM came to Nigeria and was using this figure from the World Bank that 70% of Nigerians live with less than $1 a day. And they based their whole plan on that basis and felt they'll be doing very well if they could get 400,000 in the first year to buy the cell phone. And they came in, and the first year alone, over 1.3 million bought from that one company. Because most of the informal sector don't declare their income. We don't know what they have, but it's nice to say they live on less than $1 a day. Now, that's not to say we may have more poor people, but I suggest that's still an area that is still waiting to be seriously addressed, the whole magnitude of it. We have to take the household, decompose it, the children, the youth, the women, and particularly the elderly. The general picture, particularly for the elderly, is that in the absence of any safety net, most of them tend to return to their rural setting, but we don't know. I talked about the structural factors, and I'm highlighting in particular the issue of land. Because for the reason I've given, land reform, which is so critical in Africa, is usually dismissed as too complex. And yet, until you solve it, you can't move us into the free market. Most of the farmers can't raise credit. We have tried various forms. I've been involved in trying various types of financial mechanism for the farmers. But I'm always afraid once they pass beyond a certain limit, that if they default, what do I have? Peer pressure is okay up to a certain limit. But beyond that, you need something a lot more concrete. Institutions. I've mentioned some of this. We really need to do a lot more study. I'm happy that just now there are more people coming out to Nigeria, for instance, trying to understand the role of this hometown association in the whole configuration of development. Various community-based associations, credit associations. I've also suggested as a fourth area, the functional factors. We need to know a lot more about employment within the informal sector, urban agriculture, access to services, situation within the shanty towns and so on. And finally, and more importantly, really the situation with the municipal authorities, with their mobilization of resources, their ability or inability to deliver services, but particularly the database on which they have to do anything. One of the most interesting problems you'll find trying to understand municipal situation in Africa is the very limited, in fact, the chaotic situation of data in many cities. Most houses are not numbered, most streets are not named. In fact, there are no maps. And if multilateral and bilateral agencies are trying to help, some of this, what looks quite just technical, would be the way to start. So I conclude by calling attention to the fact that the Millennium Development Goals do highlight what we need to do with regard to dealing with extreme poverty. That it should be half by 2015. But all the other goals, whether it's the combating HIV/AIDS, dealing with access to potable water, or improving lives of at least 100 million, all these are meant to impact positively on the poverty situation. What was interesting to me is that when you then leave the UN Millennium Development Goal and you take the NEPAD document, which is the document of the African leaders, you then find them saying, yes, we'll deal with poverty and sustainable development. But their emphasis is on sustainable development, and they say, okay, what we'll do with poverty, we'll wait for the international organization and will support them. Now, for me, this, of course, is the wrong priority. And so my expectation is that a global urban research agenda such as this, which I hope would be launched in a way that some of the issues I have raised could be more closely looked into, would look to be opportune in the way it has come, and that hopefully they might start making it possible for African governments to be able to develop their own internal strategy for dealing with the poverty situation in their urban centers. I'm sorry I've talked much longer than
We're actually right on schedule.
Thank you very much, then.
Thank you. First we'll hear from Mr. Cobbett.
Thank you very much. I think, Blair, in your introduction, when you were going through the professor's distinguished career, you indicated that he's been trying to retire since 1981. And I think we now know why he's been, at least in that regard, quite a failure. And long may it continue. It was a great honor for him for Professor Mabogunje to suggest that I respond and comment on some of the themes in his paper. And I'd like to do that and echo his comments about the research agenda at the beginning, but start off by saying that I believe that such a research agenda must have a clear and open bias towards policy orientation and solutions rather than a re-quantification of the misery and the problems that face Africa. And it's in that spirit that I will put before you 5 propositions and then develop those a little bit further and trying to highlight some of the research questions that would arise out of that. The first, and they, I believe, all arise and follow on from the professor's paper. The first is that Africa has an increasingly urban future. Or put it more boldly, the future of Africa will be urban. And this is the part that is never said. This is potentially very good news and is something that should be welcomed. That is proposition number 1. Proposition number 2, which is directly linked, is that the success in Africa as well as elsewhere of national economies will increasingly be predicated on the efficiency of those urban areas, of those cities and their urban workforces. So if the cities work, the national economy has a chance, and the converse will increasingly be true. The third proposition is the troubling one, which is that by and large African governments are at best ambivalent about this urban future and in many cases openly hostile to an urban future for Africa. The fourth is a consequential argument, which is that the vacuum that this then gives rise to creates a huge drag on economic growth, on the poor and on poverty reduction. And I'll argue this is the big policy gap that we need to drive into. And the fifth is to endorse the professor's characterization, and it is of course a generalization, of the over-concentration of state power, particularly in the economic and the political spheres, and to reinforce that the net result of this is to disempower local communities and non-state structures in terms of the role that they can play in the economy. If we take Africa's urban future, and I don't want to dwell too much on the numbers, but rather on the trends, but just taking the numbers, by the year 2030, Africa will add 395 million new urban residents to its existing urban areas. And that's on top of a situation where, by best estimates, which may or may not be very good, already 72% of Africa's urban areas are characterized as slums. And those figures compare. That is, by the way, higher in absolute numbers than China, which will add 342, and India, which will add 271 million. So Africa is already, and will continue to be for the next 30 years, the fastest urbanizing continent in the world, in a movement of people that is unprecedented in human history. And one of the first policy questions is, how prepared is Africa for what is already underway? This growth will come from 2 main sources, overwhelmingly: urban-rural migration of the kind that the professor referred to, and of course urban fertility and natural population growth in existing urban areas. And those proportions will change over time. If agriculture fails in Africa, the net result will be urbanization. If agriculture succeeds in Africa, the net result will be urbanization. And that message is a key one, that really needs to be understood throughout the continent. What I really liked about the paper is it highlighted the extent to which migrancy is used as a coping mechanism for the urban poor. The migrancy that the professor described is oscillatory migratory labor, which is moving between the rural and the urban dimensions within a country. But I would also argue that the oscillatory nature of this migration will decline as urbanization becomes permanent. And one of the key points to put forward is that the key to the solution to rural poverty may very well lie in urban migration, and the two are directly connected. But the policy question that arises is, if these numbers of people are going to urbanize, and we put these figures forward as certain in terms of the trend rather than their accuracy, where do the services come from? Where do the schools come from? Where does the land come from? What governance structures are going to welcome these migrants into the urban areas in Africa? This leads to two large challenges. The first is dealing with the existing situation. And I just want to quickly examine the state of play in African urban areas. And by way of a generalization, what we see is either through a policy of hostility or neglect, we see the effect of social exclusion on a massive scale. And the cost of this failure of national and local governments to recognize the rights of the poor has been the creation of enormous parallel markets, or the dual markets that the professor refers to in his paper. The net effect of which is to drive up the price of land, the price of rent, the price of services. As people urbanize or arrive in the urban areas, and there is no provision of land and services, they have to go and make do for themselves. And they do so informally, and they do so illegally. So either the failure of a weak local government or the conscious failure of a hostile local government has the same effect, which is to force people to trade for the essentials of daily life on a parallel market, which is very good news for the warlords and the slumlords who end up actually providing the land, the rent, the services. So African slum dwellers in Kibera or Korogocho or wherever do get access to water, but they buy it in a highly inefficient manner, and they pay the premium of the highest price in that given city. The same is true for land, the same is true for services, the same is true for refuse. So this is a huge inefficiency which has two losers. The first loser is, of course, the urban poor themselves, who pay more for less, and the second loser is the local authority, who gets no revenue for services that are effectively being redirected by the middle pliers of the services. And this is widespread, not only in Africa, but in any urban setting where you have a poor policy regime in terms of the local government's attitude to its own residents. What this also demonstrates is the ability and, more importantly, the willingness of the urban poor to pay for services, but in many cases the inability or unwillingness of the local authority to provide services, and in circumstances where services are provided, an unwillingness to collect because it is politically unpopular. And often you get populist politicians claiming that they're again in the national interest or the local interest not going to collect revenues from the poor. Whereas on the harshness of the informal market, the poor pay, otherwise they get no services. So that's a very crude, but I believe accurate characterization of the existing situation, which is, as I say, already harsh given the nature and extent of informal settlements, squatter areas or slums in existing urban areas in Africa. However, far more urgent and far more pressing an issue is looking into the future, which is, if this is the situation we have at the moment, how are we going to cope with the doubling of the urban populations in Africa over the next 30 years, which all statistical trends point to. I will cite for you a piece of research, and I'll give the linkages to Blair so we can circulate this afterwards. But recently, the World Bank commissioned from Solly Angel and others in New York a study of the global impact of urban expansion. It's 209 pages, unfortunately, of many photographs, so it's impossible to email this. It's a monster of a file. What it demonstrates globally is that all new urban expansion is happening at an increasingly, or at rates of decreasing density, globally at a density decrease of 1.7% per annum, but higher in Africa, but that hasn't yet been broken down. Let me translate that for you in plain and simple terms. As the population doubles, the amount of land that is consumed triples. And you just have to think of Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and imagine what does that look like. And then remember that this is in a situation where the future urbanization is not only not accepted, it is actually in many cases rejected. And the policy framework is not to accept, but is to reject. To say, go back to where you came from. But the coping mechanism of the poor states to themselves and to their families that their best opportunity lies in urbanizing and getting access to urban services, and statistically they are correct. Their best chance of climbing out of poverty, with cities clearly proven worldwide as the most effective poverty fighters, is to get into the urban areas. So unless we have, this is not an issue of research so much as of attitude and of policy, a concerted attempts by local and national governments in Africa and elsewhere, such as South Asia and Southeast Asia, to get ahead of the curve and stop always trying to catch up, then our urban areas are going to become even less efficient and more of a drag on the economy rather than a net contributor to the economy than they are at the moment. So the policy issue is, and here I very much reinforce that the emphasis the professor has given to the unlocking of the issue of land. Urban land markets and the making of them to be open, transparent, and, as he indicated, tradable, is one of the most pressing policy, research, administrative issues facing small, secondary, and major cities in Africa. And just to re-emphasize that point, most of the urbanization that we see happening across the African subcontinent is not going to Lagos or to Nairobi. It's going to middle-sized, small cities. That is where the bulk of the urbanization in numerical terms and also impact is happening. We always see the photographs from Geyer or from Lusaka, but in fact it's the small cities that are picking up the brunt, and often those are the weakest in administrative terms and in governance terms, and least able to pick up the challenge. So the policy challenge in terms of land urbanization and governance is, how can we help, or how can African local governments and national governments get ahead of the curve as part of a strategy of dealing with the existing backlog? At the moment, too many are flat-footed on both topics, which leads us to the role of local government, or in the way that Professor Mabogunje led us into it, in the problem of over-concentration of power at the center. The professor highlights the need to remove the dualism that exists at the local level of the formal and the informal. The failure of the formal leads to the expansion of the informal. And so how to put forward, how to promote responsive and representative local government structures. This will not be something achieved quickly or overnight, but that trend at least is visible in Africa, and we have strengthening local governments all over. But below that is a subcategory, which is, how can we get local governments that are predicated on actively engaging the local private sector, providing a climate for investment, seeking domestic capital, and not just the international capital that the professor referred to at the end, to become proactive developers of infrastructure to get ahead of the curve, and actively engaging with the urban poor, not as a problem, but as part of the solution. The very organizations that you referred to in terms of the homing associations and the credit companies that exist. The research focus here, I believe, should be on those cities and countries in Africa that are moving ahead. 15, at the last count that I'm aware of, 15 countries in African national economies are growing at 5% or better. What are they doing right? What are they not doing that others are doing? Let us focus on the successes that do exist in Africa. Local authorities that have gone to capital markets, raised finance to provide infrastructure. And the last of the policy areas that I would also recommend as part of this research agenda is to bring it in effect back into the room in Washington, which is to, amongst others, to rethink international development assistance. On page 9 of his paper, the professor poses a wonderful question, which I'll read in full. How does one attempt an explanation of a situation in which, in spite of efforts in recent years by multilateral organizations, bilateral donor agencies, central, local governments, foreign and local non-governmental and community-based organizations, relative and absolute incidence of chronic poverty continues to rise, whilst poverty reduction remains a formidable challenge to development effort in most countries, and particularly in Africa? What are we doing wrong? By the virtue of that question, very little development assistance is doing the right thing. In the organization for which I work, the Cities Alliance, we always make the point that in the 50 years since international development assistance has been going into, for example, slum upgrading, the size of the challenge has grown way out of proportion to the amount of assistance that's going in. Assistance has gone up. The problem has got bigger and bigger all the time. So something's not working. And are the international development agencies asking themselves the kinds of questions that they're wanting African countries also to ask and answer? In this regard, I'll just highlight a couple of items. Too much aid, we would believe, is aimed still at resolving issues of rural poverty, because that's where the majority of Africans are still, and that is correct. If you can't do it with that battery of forces, how is some targeted investment, however well-intentioned in rural areas, going to slow down processes that have their own logic, driven by people's own interpretation of their own best interest? But we still have international development agencies saying to governments, we think you should slow down the rate of urbanization. There is no model for doing this, and there is absolutely no evidence that the absence of land, the absence of water or services in the urban areas has any effect whatsoever on people's movement into the urban areas. So we need to turn that one right around. The 4-year election cycle matches the 4-year or 3-year project cycle, so the constraint of the recipient also meets the constraint of the donor in many cases. And so we have short-termism dominating the international engagement in terms of aid and assistance. And if you take a mechanism that is most common, for example, the poverty reduction strategies that is utilized in negotiation, what tends to happen is this is a dialogue between 1 or 2 ministries at the national level and the national level only, looking at sectoral policies, and a small number of international experts with their own particular expertise designing national strategies. Very, very seldom in PRSs do local governments ever get a say into the developmental agenda, or civil society, or the private sector. And so when we look and examine poverty reduction strategies in African countries, we see no evidence that there's an urban future at all. You would believe, if you're reading these things, that there is no urban, and all of Africa is agricultural, and happily so. And so there's a disconnect between the instruments of international development assistance and the reality on the ground. And this does nothing more than reinforce the very over-concentration of power that the Professor highlighted in his paper. This is one of the consequences. So from our perspective, the questions that arise is how to promote scales of action that are consistent in responding to the policy challenge that is there and visible. The issue of scale, of moving beyond projects to dealing at city-wide scales of action and nationwide scales of action, of leveraging domestic resources, domestic investment resources, which are evident in many countries in Africa but don't have good outlets for investment, and the role of subnational government, and above all else, the introduction of a long-term perspective that moves us out of the crisis management in terms of the average analysis of the problems of Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want first of all just to appreciate Professor Mabogunje's paper and also his career. I've engaged with him on urban issues, particularly in Nigeria, for 30 years. And before coming to this session this afternoon, I decided to look back at his first books from the 1960s on the city of Ibadan, published in 1967, and Urbanization in Nigeria, published in 1968. And was struck over again with the extraordinary boldness and forcefulness of his arguments and his acuity in identifying indeed many of the issues that are raised again in this paper. And it's with that particular observation in mind that I want to give a little more emphasis, or perhaps encourage him and us to give a little more emphasis to the recent historical factors with respect to the kind of situation that we are facing with respect to the poverty in African cities. Then he, particularly in his oral presentation, is tending to stress. He's tending to stress the long-term structural issues, which certainly are of great importance. But I think that there is throughout his paper, and also I think throughout William Cobbett's set of comments, allusions to particular interventions of the fairly recent past that we seriously need to come to grips with in order to think about the future. Why are people coming to the cities even though there is absolutely no infrastructure, housing, and so on? People are throwing themselves on the mercy of a voracious set of powers in the informal sector. What kinds of conditions promote this sort of engagement with the urban areas? I share William Cobbett's general orientation to the idea that the urban areas can be extraordinarily important in Africa's future. I edited a collection in 1987 called Feeding African Cities, which was the history of food supply to several major African cities. And I was extraordinarily impressed by the work that we did, the 4 case studies that we put together, at how well that food supply had in fact functioned in very different ways in different places over the history of quite dramatic urban growth in a way that was quite underappreciated. In fact, to the degree that one of the reviews of my book said, well, it's not a very useful book because it doesn't identify the problems. Whereas we were trying to suggest, well, these kinds of engagements between the rural and the urban area, the kinds of occupational associations, market organization, storage, artisanal transformation, institutions which had grown up within the informal sector had been really, in many respects, quite successful in different ways in relation to different policies in different cities. On the other hand, that said, we have this more or less contradictory situation. If we have that orientation of optimism and hope, and that the urban areas can be a major motor for economic change and for raising the standard of living of the African poor, we have the evidence of the last 10 years that looks as if on many different variables that the situation of the poor is actually declining. The dollar a day figure from the UN Millennium Goals studies, it's very disheartening. Africa is the only region of the world in which there's already a very high level, sort of 44% or something, according to the UN Millennium Goals. 44% in 1990, 46% in 2003. Living on less than $1 a day, actually rising from an extremely high level, whereas other areas of the world that in 1990 were much closer to Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and so on, all of those rates are going down. So we are facing, even with the problem of statistics, if we look at the health indicators, we have a similar sort of pattern that at best, infant mortality, maternal mortality, and so on are holding steady rather than declining. So how do we bring these two perceptions together, that there is a great deal of activity, and some of it extraordinarily innovative within the urban economies and the links between the urban and the rural economies, at the same time as this apparent slow decline or just managing to hold steady in a world where other areas seem to be doing a lot better. And I think that when we look at that, we really have to look at recent history. We have to look at what actually has happened to African economies over these last 20 to perhaps 25 years. And in many respects, I think we have to face the fact that Africa has suffered, has undergone something that is fairly close to a perfect storm of political and economic negative conditions. The plummeting of the commodity prices, the decline in agricultural prices, is part of what fuels this rural-urban migration. It's very difficult to make an adequate living in many of these the rural economies, even if people would like to stay in the rural areas. Of course, we have climate instabilities since the 1960s, which in some areas have also been very, very problematic. We have had, alongside the decline in commodity prices, a kind of political instability, in many places destruction of the infrastructure that is precisely required for the development of market economies as a result of civil wars and various kinds of strife at a much higher level than in previous decades. We have had this downsizing of government, the limitation in the investment in African infrastructures during this last 20 years or so. So we are looking at urbanization not as a generic phenomenon, I would suggest, but as a having particular characteristics that come out of the political and economic history of the 1980s and the 1990s, and which does result in, no matter how much innovation and organizational complexity that there certainly is in many of the urban centers that we look at with respect to employment, provisioning in the informal sector, that we have a situation where it's increasingly difficult to make that work, to also raise the level of living of the population and not just hold steady. So what then does that mean? As you know, I'm a scholar. I'm in the university and not in the policy work. What does that mean in terms of what I would think of as really fruitful research to carry out? Well, first of all, I want to draw attention to a characteristic of Professor Mabogunje's work throughout his career, which I think we need to absolutely endorse, which is, he says on page 1 of this paper, that we need to look at what he calls many strands of the issues. That is that we need to have in mind the interconnections amongst phenomena. That is, pulling out discrete variables and correlating them is going to be a problematic way of cutting into what have become very complex patterns of mutual imbrication in the ways that some of these phenomena have developed over these last 20 years. What he does in this paper, but also in his own work, is to constantly trace out the entailments. What if you have family ownership of land? What does that mean for the ability to raise assets on the financial markets? What kind of financial markets do you therefore have? What are the limitations on those financial markets? What are the relationships between those informal financial markets and the larger political and economic institutional framework of the urban economy? So he traces out from specific key factors the entailments, not the correlates, but the entailments for the institutional development of particular urban centres. And I think that this is an approach that we absolutely have to pursue if we are going to understand the sheer complexity of the response of these urban populations to these conditions that people have lived under this last 20 or so years, and national governments, as William Cobbett has pointed out, the response of national governments to those conditions. But where I want to be a bit more, perhaps to diverge 10 degrees from at least the way that Professor Mabogunje presented his paper, is to say that I think that we need to look very closely at the entailments, not only on the side of the informal sector, its own constitution, which actually is my own research. So now I'm suggesting there's a whole different line of research to be done here. I think that certainly needs to be looked at much more closely. But I think that from his paper we can understand that the incursions, the interventions within the formal sector itself, and by that I mean the local government structures, the national government structures, the aid community interventions, that these have been, over these same 20 years, very incoherent. That these interventions have not added up, they have not entailed one another, they have not paid attention to the mutual implications of various kinds of policy interventions. And I think that this has been very much a part of the failures of these last 20 years, and it absolutely behooves us as citizens of the countries that are developing some of these policies to look very critically at what they have been and how they have been translated into the African context. I want to just give one example from this book that Blair mentioned, Money Struggles and City Life, which was a collective research project that was sponsored by and dedicated to Professor Mabogunje, that myself and 15 other scholars carried out in Ibadan under the end of the Abacha regime, 1997. We tried to understand how people were simply managing under military rule and structural adjustment. What was happening to these informal sector organizations, what was happening to occupations, what was happening to families, and so on. And there are a couple of papers in here which are about the political infrastructure of Ibadan, what happened to it under this particular rubric. Well, two things, but roughly speaking. One of them was the real dismemberment of a kind of civil service approach to municipal management in favor of a political patronage politics that came largely from the central power, so that the systems of accountability went up, personal loyalty far more than they went up, as they had previously been instituted as a municipal authority, with the kinds of frameworks of appointment and promotion and accountability and division of functions and so on that Nigeria had pursued up until that point. This is massively disorganizing of any kind of policy approach to the city as a unit. And then secondly, the local government, I think we have to be very careful. What local do we mean by local government? During the Abacha period, the city of Ibadan was more or less disempowered as a city by being divided into local government areas. It was divided into several different local government areas. The central municipal authority was weakened. None of those local government areas had enough money to function because they didn't have enough of a tax base, at least in part because there's no real estate property tax rate system of the kind that we're familiar with in our own municipal governments. They were dependent on licenses and fees and market fees and so on. They had no money to deliver any services to the populations to whom they were technically accountable. The proportion of the budget for those local governments that was supposed to come, in theory, from a derivation account from the state and national government, became very unpredictable, was insufficient also for the supportive activities. So you got the local government organization that was utterly disempowered, was there, paid itself salaries, more or less, but more less than more, but was able to do, realistically able to do very little for the population. So I think that we need to look very carefully at what the policies have been and what their implications have been, what their entailments have been realistically in the organization of city life, all the way from the authorities, the central authorities, the various functional authorities, out to all of these various more or less informal forms of organization. And I do want to point out that, when I look back at Professor Mabogunje's books, I wanted to read you something from the book that he wrote on urbanization in 1968. He wrote here, this is page 317 for the scholars here, "The single most important problem of these growing centers is that of urban management. A city, like any economic organization, requires qualified, enlightened, and experienced management to function efficiently and profitably." And I think that goal was certainly a goal in the 1960s. It was in the process of, at least in Nigeria, it was in the process of being being developed, of being put in place, of being Nigerianized, and so on. And it's this infrastructure which has come under enormous pressure, not only from, as it were, the perfect storm of conditions out there in the African world at large, which are an extraordinary challenge by any measure whatsoever, but also by policies at various different levels and interventions at various different levels that have not enabled that kind of organization to take root, to reproduce itself, and to meet any of these challenges of imagination about the future, or funding and strategic investment in ways of dealing with future problems. Let me leave it there.
Thank you. Professor Mabogunje, would you like to respond to anything, or shall we open it up? Okay. Why don't we open it up and see if there are questions, comments, observations? Let me begin, and I want to. This is a more general observation about what all three of you say and have been saying, and I want to couch it by talking about a body of research in the part of the world that I study, the former Soviet Union. And there have been, there's extensive research now on the background to the horrible 20th century that the part of the world between Kiev and Warsaw lived through. And as people get into archives, what is developing is a sense that the modern state was incapable of dealing with complexity. And therefore, the modern state tried to categorize a complex reality. In this case, the research is specifically talking about religion and ethnic identity. But as modern states moved into a part of the world that was too complex, they imposed categories of identification, tagging who people were. And that process was the precondition for both the Stalinist repressions and the Holocaust. As I listen to you, all three of you, I'm struck. $1 a day poverty level, that makes great sense. You can put that on a newspaper headline. You can put that on the top of a memorandum. Yet you are all describing a reality that may be beyond the capacity not of impoverished African states, but in general of the modern state, because technical assistance programs, I'm thinking about, listening to all of you, it's all very well and good to talk about empowerment and local level and talking about different conceptions of morality, but how do international institutions engage in a meaningful way that complexity? Where are the moments at which there can be a productive link between the informal warehouses and market systems that actually would feed an African city? And it's not just a question of capitalism, it also has to do with the objectives of what the modern state tries to do. Where are the moments of opportunity that each of you see in the story that you tell for something more productive than the declaration of $1 a day?
I take that down.
That's question number one. We'll return to that. Let me ask if there are other questions and comments out there, maybe more specific to the papers. Go right here.
Thank you for your illuminating discussions. I would like to invite you to, sorry. Thank you for your illuminating discussions. I would like to invite you to think a bit more broadly of the category, the urban poor, about which we have heard in these presentations. The category has been disaggregated slightly by some reference to the uncertainty about what the $1 a day means, and we have heard about some new poverty that distinguishes the urban poor from some who might have been called poor according to some other characterizations. We have heard a lot about the scale of urban growth, and this is where I want to enter, because I would invite you to think of breaking down that also in other terms. For example, in terms of age and generation, and in gender terms. It is a fact when we look at the urbanization process in Africa that in addition to being also the fastest in the world, it is probably also the one in which you have the single highest category of what we would call young people under, say, 25 years of age. Won't we have to bring observations like this right into the middle of discussions of policy? Similarly, don't we also need to bring the gender story right into talking about these policies? I know you're speaking in very general terms, but I think there needs to be opened up here, and there might be other specificities. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody want to respond, or should we collect a couple more comments? Why don't we keep going? I think there's a question right here.
Right, sorry, I'm Sarah Berry from Johns Hopkins University. Thank all the panelists for a really rich series of presentations. I'd like to focus on the kind of what I see as an example of the intersection between the problems you've all alluded to with sort of misdirected or counterproductive international interventions. And the particular problem Akin spoke about of the process of decentralizing authority often stops with deconcentrating power but doesn't really empower local bodies to begin dealing effectively with some of these kinds of problems that would make the lives of the poor better. And I've seen in my own work in recent years, for example, the Ghana Water and Sewage Corporation disbands, basically says to local authorities, okay, now you manage your own water supply and sewage disposal system, and you pay for it. So then the question is, all right, where are the resources coming from at the local level? And in work I've been doing which has focused not in rural areas, but in towns and some of these exploding suburbs that William Cobbett talked about, there's money around at the local level, and it comes from the land market. Land is tradable, but those transactions are not transparent. And so part of the problem is that some of the people who are profiting the most from the growing price of land and transactions therein are the same local authorities who aren't about to tell anybody what they're making from the deal. And so, you know, I think this is an example of the kind of dilemma that complicates this process of delegating responsibility to local levels. And I would just add that the World Bank has been pouring resources in the last few years into precisely developing the quote-unquote capacities of Ghanaian chiefs, who are some of the key players in the local land market.
I think there were still two more. Okay, why don't we take these two and we'll come back to the panel in this corner. We're making Mijgan run around.
Sure. I'm Dave Liebson, retired from AID and now a consultant in the business with PET. I guess when you ask about research, the question I would have is the situation truly unique? In other words, we're talking about Africa and we're looking at Africa, but have there been or not other places and other experiences in other parts of the world that were, if not identical, very close to the situations of different, and Africa is not unique. I mean, not, you know, there are lots of different kinds of situations within Africa as well, but are there situations in other places and other times that were parallel, and what can one draw from that experience in applicability to then situations in Africa? Seems to me that would be an area of research that would be useful to understand.
And why don't we take the fourth question, and then you can pick and choose what you want to answer. Right here.
Oh,
right there.
I'm so sorry.
Do we need it? Well,
yeah. Actually, we do.
My name is John Vashlewski, and I'm with USAID. And first of all, I'd like to say to the professor, I'm sort of sorry that the same question you posed in 1968 you put on the table essentially today in terms of these issues of management. I have another, it's a broad question. There are a lot of specifics and causal factors and things, but the future seems to me to be somehow or another, not where we go, but how we get there, answerable in this question. Is that where is the leadership? Now that's an unfair question on a number of levels, and the leadership needs to come from a number of sectors, including the donors, clearly. But within Africa, I might ask the professor and those that have studied it more than I do, where is it? Where are there, in fact, where is there evidence of hope in the sense that it strikes me that where political power exists at all, particularly in Africa, that you would believe that it exists, other than the guy that's in charge of the army, in the urban areas, where you have critical masses of people, where you have sort of an identifiable base, whether it be a family association or whether it be a neighborhood or some other sort of affinity group. But where is the leadership in Africa? And how can the donors capitalize on that initiative to move some of these very more important questions forward? So that, I think maybe that's a sort of a very general question that might in fact help figure out how we get to the answer to the specifics that were brought up.
Okay, we have several questions on the table. Why don't we just move down the panel and we'll see how much we can cover.
Let me start by thanking everybody for the question they asked. But let me start by saying I retired from the university in 1981. I have been in the public domain since then. One of the things I learned, and I want to start with you, is that, you know, a $1 a day statement looks good. When it comes to implementation, you find everything cross-cutting, and it is your ability to strengthen those things step by step that will get results. Because as a policy, it's a statement. For implementation, you have to break it down in a way in which you can get results. And some of the things that link together initially looks as if they have nothing to do with each other. I've been involved in housing, but it has meant I had to get government to accept a pension fund system, which on the face of it, people may not see how they relate. But until they could do that, set up a contributory pension scheme we had no basket of long-term savings to deal with housing. Now, and so it is in policy to make a statement. When it comes to implementation, you learn to look at the cross-cutting nature and take it one by one. And that gets me to the issue of data. Because in fact, it's interesting you said what I said in 1968, because what Stolper said in 1962 about planning without facts. He wrote a book after doing our plan. It's still a fact today. And because there are no data, which allows us both to monitor and to manage the illegalities, the informal administration goes on. And now that I'm being asked to handle Lagos, the first thing I have to do is to make sure that systematically we put in place the data that allows not only me as a monitor, but also the people performing to be able to see whether they're performing right or not. Now, the uniqueness of the African situation, it's very interesting. I studied in London, and my old professor was a professor of historical geography. And what interested me in British historical geography was the fact that really up till about 1800, land was owned in the same manner as we do in Africa, small intermixed strips. But government took upon itself to survey every one of those strips, to make awards on them, to give people titles to their land, and then you can start talking about a free market economy. Initially, of course, what it did was provoke a massive poverty in Britain. But the basis for resolving it was there. Because people had assets. You sold it to the big farmer or something, and you moved. In Africa, what I'm saying is that, in fact, precisely because we have no landed gentry we could attack. We could say, these are landlords, we want to take their land. Like China did, and say land to the tiller. The tiller already have the land in Africa. Our government have just been, they kept being told, you know, to do this titling thing is too complex. Of course, development is complex. And you have to find a systematic way of giving those people their assets in a way in which it makes sense within a free market economy. Now, if you don't do it, then of course, you not only, you know, when they leave the rural area, it's a waste because nobody takes it over. We just leave it. I mean, one of the most striking features, if you went to most African countries, is the amount of land just left waste. If you try to take it over, you suddenly discover it's owned. Okay. So, whereas if we created a framework within which if I'm not using it, I can sell it, then at least I have some capital, and if I don't want to sell it, at least I have a document. Okay. That's what Hanado de Soto has been trying to tell us all the time, that you do empower the individual when you deal with that. And that gets me to the issue of leadership. What's leadership? It's really the idea you bring to bear on issues. In most of Africa, we went through a period whilst the Soviet was there in which we thought the state, if you can control the state, that's power. It's been interesting. Joel Migdal wrote the book on strong society and weak states. And in fact, what you find is that most African governments are very weak in the sense that they don't make laws that we would naturally want to follow. Half the time we take an exit option. Okay, they have their soldiers, so we keep quiet and go on doing our things, expanding the informal market and so on. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to say, however, is that that was the period when the state was said to be everything, the parastatal, the iron and steel and so on. And it was interesting because at that time we could look at the Russian model, which we thought was achieving things. At least it sent Sputnik to the moon. Okay. Then it collapsed. And you really, what is interesting is watching the new, both the democratic movement in Africa and the free market. It's gradually creating space. It's making this leadership thing not a one-man show, because it means entrepreneurs, local and international, are also having their own field day. What it will mean, of course, we'll have to see, but it's interesting that in that context, a lot more people are being involved in government. We have laws which are still, okay, as I said, I was involved with housing, and we had to look at about 34 laws to make what we're trying to achieve possible. Because even the simple law like Trustees Act, which has to be able to allow trustees to go to the market and say, I want to buy stock, bond in the Now, all of these are things which are now gradually being talked about, thought about, because the private sector, the free market economy is coming on stream. Land is still central. And in Africa, until we face the land reform, which, as I said, its problem is the fact that we don't have a class we could fight. It's all in our own hands. And we have to be able to say, we must design a strategy that allows you to come and register what you have, either as a community. In South Africa, you're starting to say a whole group can come and register in their name. We must find a solution. So I want again to say that I'm not unmindful of the disaggregation. I think we don't know enough about it. Generally with the youth, we say they are unemployed, but there are things happening there, and what I did try to do in my paper is to say we need to know a lot more. It's a category we can't ignore. What's happening with the urban, the adult children of the urban poor, whether they're girls, whether they're boys, the children, we see the street children problem. It's growing in some cities and so on. So, as I said, there are areas here which, to my way of thinking, as we move away from the over-concentration of the past, and we're playing with those two, I always tell them it's two revolutions going on. Democratic governance, which is not only representative, but participatory. And those are two separate things. And we have to learn that it's not enough to say, I elect you and you go away for 4 years, I don't see you. You have to engage the people much more in the whole way in which governance takes place. That's one revolution going on. The other, of course, is the free market. And it's gradually coming through because I'm afraid there's no other game in town just now. As we watch them coming through, new problems will be thrown up. But I'm sure some of the old problems will get more attention than they've got so far. Again, I want to say thank you to all those who've raised questions.
We have 3 minutes left. Let me just see if the other panelists want to add anything, and then we'll wrap up.
But just on the same sort of theme, I think part of the answer lies in a much clearer focus on institutional relationships, which means making sure local government does what it's meant to do, and the converse of that is gets its butt out of doing what it's not meant to do. And the same is true for national government. And that is often a problem, is that you have this crowding out of relationships. So in shorthand, with 1.5 minutes to go, if the majority of housing is being built by the poor, just to take a silly example, but a very effective example, don't fight it. Formalize that as the system of delivery, and see how much more people could produce if you've got an administrative and regulatory regime that supports them, rather than spends all of its time fighting it, which is so. And there are good examples of leadership. Mbaban has set itself a target of being a city without slums by 2015. So has Dar es Salaam. Lagos, there are very many things that the governor of Lagos State has done to demonstrate leadership. And there's no one here who can teach anyone how to manage a city like Lagos. The rule book hasn't been written. Senegal, Dakar and the country is going for a nationwide approach to urban upgrading. So there are good examples, and as always, the biggest problem in this is that we reduce an entire continent to one epithet called Africa, and that just doesn't allow us to talk about Guinea and Liberia and Mbaban at the same time, because they're very different countries, which doesn't help you at all at the end.
Maybe just two things that I think that have research implications. One of them, I very much endorse this notion that you need to look at different cities separately from each other. I mean, different cities have some very different processes, very different elite structures, very different relationships between the wealthy and the governmental leadership, and that can be part of our comparative knowledge that is being suggested over here. It can be comparative knowledge within Africa that I think is going to be extraordinarily important. Detroit is not Atlanta. Detroit is not Chicago. There's a comparative project in Africa as there would be here. And then the other thing I think that that many of us who are scholars here have been very interested in is this process of formalization, is the relationship, the back and forth relationship between the so-called formal and informal sector, and really trying to go beyond dichotomizing into here's the formal sector, here's the informal sector, but really trying to look at different ways in which formalization mediates those relationships. And I think that probably, just to come to one suggestion or one note in Sarah's question, that we probably don't know very well for many cities is how the money that's there, the wealth that's there, relates to the power that's there, right? And in those kinds of dynamics, one is certainly looking at the dynamics of the future, the relationships between the political and the monetary. And so it may be that a focus on those dynamics would be very particularly important for the future.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience. I remind you to please be sure to fill out the evaluation forms. We will have Professor Mabogunje's paper online once it's been revised, together with the other papers presented in the series with the urban team at AID, and the webcast should be available probably next week as well. So thank you all very, very much.
So now that I'm back, I'm going to start working on this, getting the budget modified. Have you been part of that conversation? Where I just...